guest this week on Veterans Chronicles is Jeff Struecker. Jeff served our nation as a U.S. Army Ranger and eventually retired as a U.S. Army chaplain. He's now a pastor at a church in Georgia. And Jeff, thanks very much for being with us.
It's great to be here.
You have quite a distinguished military career that we'll get to, serving in Panama and Desert Storm and Somalia. And well, we're going to start where we always start. Where were you born and raised?
Well, I was born in Iowa, but raised really all over the place. I moved more than 20 times before even graduating from high school, so I didn't really have a place to call home.
Was your family military or just moved for other reasons?
No, my parents divorced when I was young, and whenever there was a better job offer, my mother moved. I lived with my mother, and she picked up and moved every time there was a better job offer, so we moved a lot.
Was there much of a military history in your family?
I didn't really come from a military family. My grandfather served in World War II, had an uncle that served in Vietnam, but none of them really talked about their military service, and my close family had no military service at all. So for me, it was just kind of a thing to do to get out of my hometown, to go talk to an Army recruiter.
Why the Army?
Yeah, I don't know why the Army. I really didn't have anybody steering me in any one direction. And a friend of mine in high school, we were still in high school together, seniors in high school. He had just enlisted in the Army. He kind of told me, hey, go talk to the recruiters that I talked to. And that's kind of how the conversation started.
So once you signed up, where did you go from there?
I enlisted while I was still in high school. After graduation, I went to Fort Benning, Georgia, and went through basic training, infantry training, airborne school, and was assigned to the 75th Ranger Regiment in Fort Benning.
What was Ranger training like?
Yeah, Ranger training is a challenge. If you are not familiar with it, it's considered some of the most challenging leadership training in the military. And Ranger School, in particular, uses sleep deprivation, food deprivation, really long movements to physical exhaustion to put a person, bring them to basically the limits of their physical abilities, and then put them in leadership positions. So most everybody who's been through Ranger School will tell you they'll never, ever forget how bad it was on them while they were in Ranger School, and I would tell you the same thing.
Did you ever think of dropping out or tapping out at any point?
I don't know if there's many people who have ever attempted Ranger School who didn't think about tapping out a time or two. But for me, my commitment was I'm going to make it through this course or I'm going to die trying. And quite literally, I may end up dying trying, but I am not going to leave here.
So what year is this that you've enlisted and now completed Ranger School?
I enlisted in the Army in 1987, went to Ranger School the next year. I was still a private in the Ranger Regiment when I showed up to Ranger School in 1988, and I finished the course in December of 1988.
It was about a year later then that Operation Just Cause is launched, correct?
Yes.
The eviction of Manuel Noriega from Panama. Right. Where were you when you got those orders, and what did it mean for you?
Yeah, I was a sergeant in the Ranger Regiment in 1989. I was in the Ranger Regiment's reconnaissance detachment. And this is a clandestine unit that goes ahead of the Ranger battalions when they go to combat. So we had been notified 2 or 3 times in the fall of 1989 that the U.S. might be invading Panama. In fact, it was looking pretty serious, like we might invade. And then for whatever reason, at the last moment, every time that we got notified, that invasion got canceled. On the late December notification, this one for me I knew was real because the unit was scheduled to leave the next day to go back to hometown on leave. And that night, early the next morning, when everybody was supposed to sign out and everybody was supposed to fly home, they canceled all of those leave, everybody that was scheduled to go on leave, and said, hey, we're going to Panama again, which is what most guys thought. And I told several of my buddies, no, I think this is for real, because even the bigwigs are supposed to be going on leave today, and their leave got canceled. And that doesn't happen if it's just another training exercise.
And so once you were on your way, what was the orders?
Yeah, I got sent down to Panama early. The invasion started on the night of December 20th, 1989. I showed up there on December 19th, about 24 hours early. And our unit, the Ranger Regiment, was conducting parachute assaults onto 2 airfields. This is the first part of the invasion, and we anticipated that some of the aircraft that were dropping Rangers would get shot down, and we needed a search and rescue force. So I flew down there early in secrecy and provided a search and rescue force for the night of the invasion. Next week or two, the Ranger Regiment, along with all of the rest of the assault force or the invasion force, was trying to first defeat the Panamanian Defense Forces. But our mission, this Special Operations Task Force, was ultimately to get Manuel Noriega, as you just mentioned, and capture him, put him in custody, send him back to the United States to stand trial, which we got to him before the end of the year.
What type of resistance did you face, if any?
Yeah, the first 24 to 48 hours, there was some pretty stiff resistance from the Panamanian Defense Forces, but after that, they quickly made their way back into the countryside. I think many of them decided this isn't worth fighting for. And I don't mean they weren't willing to die. I think they weren't willing to fight for their country's leader. They just decided this guy isn't worth keeping around in power. By 10 days, 8 or 10 days into it, I literally had guys handcuffing themselves in their own handcuffs and turning their weapons into me, saying, "Hey, we don't want to fight the U.S. We're surrendering." So it wasn't the stiff fighting that I expected in Panama. Though there was a time or two where I was in a pretty good firefight.
Was that your first experience in combat?
Yes. By this point, almost everyone that was in the invasion of Panama, this is their first experience in combat. When I showed up to the Ranger Regiment, there were really 2 types of guys in the Ranger Regiment. There were folks that had been around either since Vietnam, or just a handful of guys that took part in the invasion of Grenada in 1983, Operation Urgent Fury. For 95% of us, though, no one had any real military experience. And some of them have been in the Army for 15 years with no real military experience at this point. But my boss and my platoon sergeant who went to Panama with me, he had been involved in the invasion of Grenada. And he was able to basically tell me, this is what it's going to be like. This is how you should react. And really, his combat experience helped get me ready for what we were going to experience in Panama.
So it pretty much was what he told you it would be?
Yeah, it was basically exactly what he said it was going to be.
So does your heart skip a beat a couple times, though, once the bullets are flying?
Rangers train extensively, 48 weeks a year, to go to combat. And so this is the thing that we had been training for years. But I'll tell you, it was high adrenaline and lots of moving from target to target to target with not a whole lot of sleep in between. But it was basically what I thought it was going to be. To some degree, it was a little bit of a letdown that the enemy resistance wasn't stiffer than what we experienced, but kind of what I expected.
So that's Christmas, essentially, of 1989. And the next summer, Iraq invades Kuwait. Where are you at this point, and what happens once Operation Desert Shield gets going?
I'm still in the Ranger Regiment when Iraq invades Kuwait and when Desert Shield kicks off. At this point, there's lots of discussion back and forth at the highest levels of the U.S. military about what is the role of special operations in a desert war. There was some plans to send all of the Ranger Regiment to Kuwait or to Iraq as part of Desert Storm. That got turned off at the last second. Really, there was some discussion about whether any special operations should go, and a very small special operations contingent went over when the ground war started to go find and destroy Scud missiles. I was still part of the reconnaissance detachment of the Ranger Regiment and eventually went over there in December of 91. So this is weeks, a month or two after the ground war had really wrapped up, and went over there to conduct a show of force exercise on the border that was still considered, combat zone at the time, and still considered part of Operation Desert Storm. Eventually, the 1st Ranger Battalion went over there as part of this show of force mission and did a giant battalion live fire exercise on the border with Kuwait. and Iraq.
Panama and Iraq are obviously two very different places. So in addition to knowing the tactics of warfare, what did those different experiences tell you about responding to the cultures in different places?
Yeah, Panama and Kuwait did share similarly that even the Iraqi military, as the air campaign started to progress and before the ground war began, many of them were losing their will to fight. So by the time the ground war kicks off, 24 to 48 hours into it, many of the Iraqi military, hundreds of thousands of them, in fact, are surrendering before they even put up a fight. And this is similar to what we experienced in Panama. And again, I thought to myself, I don't know if it's because of the overwhelming superiority of America's military might, like our technology, the troops that we put on the ground, they're clearly head and shoulders above everybody else out there. I don't know if that's why they're surrendering or if it's just don't really believe in the cause. This little special operations team that I was in, the reconnaissance team, did come under enemy fire from across the border in Iraq while we were doing this show of force mission in Kuwait. And it almost became an international incident in that I had this satellite radio and had to call back to the U.S. and basically determine are we really going to do a training mission, or are we going to go across the border and respond to this enemy gunfire that we're getting? And it was a tense gunfight in for just a little bit while we were on that border, but it didn't really last very long.
Jeff, we're going to pause right there, come back with much more of your story on Veterans Chronicles. Our guest this week on Veterans Chronicles is Jeff Struecker, served our nation as a U.S. Army Ranger and eventually retired as a U.S. Army Chaplain. He's now a pastor in Georgia. We've been talking about his military experience in Panama and in Desert Storm. And Jeff, you're also part of a crew that's been immortalized in film and is well known now in terms of Blackhawk Down, and that was in Somalia, which started as a humanitarian mission in late 1992, turned into something very different in 1993. When were you sent to Somalia? My battalion was scheduled to do a large training exercise in Texas. This is in the summer of 1993, an exercise that we had been planning for and preparing for quite some time. While we're in Texas, and I think this is around the late June, early July timeframe, maybe a little bit later than that, we got notified one company from that battalion, my company of Rangers, Bravo Company, 3rd Ranger Battalion, was going to go to the East Coast and go join a Special Operations Task Force and go train for something, but we didn't even know what we were training for. Just stop what you're doing here in Texas, go fly over to the East Coast. We'll tell you when we get over there. I knew that Somalia was picking up in intensity, but quite frankly, Rangers are prepared to respond anywhere and everywhere in the world at any moment. So for me, it could have been any place, but it was likely Somalia. So when we showed up, Fort Bragg, North Carolina, we got notified, hey, this is Somalia, and you're going to be part of a small task force that's going to go over there to remove a warlord from power. Again, there was this argument that I was unaware of at the time at the national command level between the Special Operations Command and the highest levels of leadership in the United States about what the rules of engagement would be for this little small Special Operations Task Force. Our commander at the time was General Wayne A. Downing, and what I learned later was these rules of engagement were so restrictive that General Downing basically said to the Secretary of Defense and the President, I'm not going to send soldiers over there, I'm not going to send any warriors over there under these conditions. And so several days into training for the invasion or for the deployment to Somalia, we got notified, hey, we're not going to go, which is not that unusual for Rangers. Got right back on airplanes, flew right back to Texas, picked right back up with the rest of the unit, doing the training that everybody was doing. And less than 24 hours later, got pulled right back out of that training, put back on airplanes, flew back to North Carolina. And this time it was for real.
we got sent over with this really small, very tailored task force to go find Muhammad Farah Aidid and the high-ranking leadership from his Haber-Getter clan and remove these guys from power. Our primary goal was to capture them and send them to the United Nations for prosecution, but if not, we were just going to kill them and take them out of the equation and try to prevent the situation in Somalia from deteriorating into chaos.
So how long had you been there before October 3rd?
Let me see if I can get my dates right. I think we showed up to Somalia early August. We had a 6-week goal in mind, and we had some specific target sets that we were going to chase after. So we started making our way through the Aidid clan. We thought this thing would be done in 6 weeks, but by October 3rd, we're over there now for going on our 3rd month, and it's still not progressing as fast as we thought. And quite honestly, we're getting a lot of pressure from the Clinton administration to wrap this thing up and to get out of there, because the news is laying into the administration about Somalia. They're calling it another Vietnam, and it's not doing well for his poll. For the approval ratings. Thank you. So we're getting lots and lots of pressure. Go get this guy, get this thing done, and get out of there, and get back to the States. And we're trying to, do this thing in such a way that we can get in, hit a target, and get out of there with disturbing the least amount of people, because the capital city, Mogadishu, is pretty small. It's densely packed with Somali clans, and it is a large or a big portion of the city is controlled almost exclusively by Aidid. So when we leave, he knows where we're at. He knows the direction that we're going. He may not know where we're going to end up, but he knows just about everything as soon as we leave the little hangar at the airfield where we were staying.
So what's the mission on October 3rd?
It's ultimately to go get 2 senior leaders in Aidid's clan, guys by the name of Saeed and Salad. And these 2 guys are meeting in the Bakara market part of Somalia, which is controlled by Aidid. And we want to get in there, hit the target, get these 2 guys and any of their associates, put them on vehicles and get out of there. And the goal is to be in and out in less than 30 minutes. I think I should stress, though, this is a broad daylight, what's called sometimes a daring daylight raid, and this was really, really unusual for special operations. Almost only at night does special operations do missions, and it's just because of the technology and the equipment and the way that the way that special operators train. They're most capable, most lethal on the battlefield at night. We've been tracking some targets, and these 2 guys, which are both pretty high-ranking guys, happen to be meeting in the same building at the same time. I think that's one of the reasons that made this so urgent. But clearly, one of the other reasons is there's a lot of pressure on us right now to get this thing wrapped up, and we would prefer to just watch these guys, wait until nightfall, hit them at night. But because of the pressure from the Clinton administration, because these 2 guys are meeting at the same place at the same time, we launched the mission to go get these 2 guys.
So you take off, you're in a Blackhawk, and what happens next?
Yeah, my role is not on the Blackhawks, it's on the Humvees. So typically what Task Force Ranger did, we didn't always do missions by helicopter, but generally speaking, Task Force Ranger would fly in special operators on Little Bird helicopters. Rangers from my unit would fly in on Blackhawks, and then a contingency of Humvees would come in the city streets, which were led by me and my platoon leader, Lieutenant Larry Moores. The vehicles were there so that when they were done taking down the target building, all of the bad guys would be placed on the Humvees. And the city streets are too narrow to land helicopters, so everybody who flew in on helicopters would jump in on the vehicles. And then our mission was to drive them out of the city streets. And that's kind of what happened in October 3rd during Blackhawk Down, except that when the Blackhawks were flying in and the Rangers were sliding down the ropes, one of those Rangers portrayed in the movie Blackhawk Down, named Todd Blackburn, missed the rope, and he fell in about 70 feet and landed in the city streets head first. So my battalion commander, Colonel Danny McKnight, as soon as I got to the target building, dispatched me immediately to go get Blackburn, put him on a Humvee, put some protection around him, and then get him back to our surgeon and try to get him immediate medical attention. So I wasn't even on the target building for 5 minutes whenever I was already getting dispatched to leave and to take this critically wounded Ranger back to the base. And it's on the way back to the base that I get through this incredible gunfight, and ultimately guys are killed right around me, and then eventually get dispatched again and again in and out of the city streets.
Talk about how you react to this when you're trying to get this fellow Ranger back for urgent medical treatment, and you can't because this firefight is broken out, and it happens again and again.
Yeah, one of the things that I think I'd like to stress to anybody who's seeing this or hearing this is in Panama, guys are locking themselves in their handcuffs and turning themselves over to us. In Desert Storm, they're surrendering by the hundreds of thousands. But when we arrived in Somalia, the day that we arrived, we come under gunfire. We come under artillery fire or indirect fire from mortars and artillery. And that gunfire, that artillery and rocket fire, it never really let up the whole time that we were there. So all of the men from my squad, I'm a Ranger squad leader at this point, and I've got about 10 men that I'm responsible for. None of them have been to combat. I'm one of those old timers now at 24 years old with a lot of combat experience. And the day that we arrived there, I let my soldiers know, like, this is an enemy that is willing to fight, unlike what we experienced in Kuwait or in Panama. These guys are willing to fight, and it looks like these guys are willing to die for what they believe in, I guess. There is more to it than that. I mean, certainly there were drugs involved, and the distribution of drugs made guys willing to go do something that's really illogical. It doesn't make sense because they were all hopped up on this African drug called khat. But they were willing to fight for more drugs and willing to kill or die for more drugs. So they became a pretty lethal force. Like, I really got to give credit to these Somali gunmen for the courage that they had. And that was the entire time that we were there. There really wasn't a night that we didn't come under some kind of enemy attack the entire time that we were there. So by the time we get to October 3rd, and we're going into the very heart of the ID'd part of town. This is like kicking a hornet's nest, and you know it's going to be bad. We just didn't know how bad is it going to be. And our intelligence was pretty good, but there's no way to determine how many bad guys are in there. Could be 200, could be 2,000, could be 20,000. We don't know. When you get in there, you'll quickly figure it out. And what we figured out is there were a whole lot more bad guys than we expected. So taking Blackburn back to the base, I was already under gunfire whenever I went to get to Blackburn and place him on Humvees and start to take him back to the base. I came through what is to this day the most intense gunfight that I've ever been in. On a city street that's probably less than 20 meters wide, I came under gunfire from 100 directions at once. And most of that gunfire was from point-blank range. A guy who's sitting right behind me on a machine gun named Dominic Pilla was shot in the forehead and killed instantly. He's the first guy killed in action from our task force. Very much like it's depicted in the movie Blackhawk Down. I had to make a radio call to my platoon sergeant, Bob Gallagher, and tell him that we had a guy who's KIA, and unfortunately, because of how intense this fight was and because of what was happening to the assault force, I had to make the radio call, hey, Dominic Pilla is dead. And when I did that, the whole radio went silent because I think most of the guys that were in the city streets at this point realized, I think I'm going to die next. Like, too many bad guys, not nearly enough of us. There's not enough ammunition and enough guns to get out of the city alive now. And that's really what most of us experienced the rest of the night. I eventually made it back to the base, and when I got back to the base, my Humvees were shot to pieces. I didn't know that two of the Blackhawks that were flying around were already shot down. We had placed our search and rescue force, which we had kept in reserve. We had placed them at the crash site for the first down helicopter. When the second helicopter went down, now we don't have anybody left to go send out there. So as soon as I got back to the base, dropping off Todd Blackburn and vehicles shot to pieces, and Dominic Pillow's already dead, my platoon leader dispatched me to go right back out there and to go to the Mike Durant crash site and to go see if there are any survivors and get everybody who may still be alive and bring them back to the base. And this is, for me, what I've told audiences before, is the most terrifying moment of my life, without a doubt.
Being told to go back in, or what you encountered there?
Because it may be hard for somebody who doesn't have military experience to understand. Going into a battle the first time, you're kind of ignorant. You don't know what you're going to get until you get there. And once you get there, then you figure out how bad it is. Going in there the first time, which is what my men did with me, I kind of had an idea of what this might be like, but no real clue until we got into this battle in Blackhawk Down. Driving Blackburn back out and getting guys killed right next to me, I knew, as well as everybody around me, okay, this is crazy. All of us are going to die tonight, is really what we thought. And getting sent right back into the exact same spot basically said, hey, we know this is suicide. We know you're probably going to die, but we don't have a choice. You need to get back on the Humvees. You need to go back out there. You need to see if there are any survivors. And honestly, our unit got a lot of criticism. Before the book and the movie Blackhawk Down came out, we came under a lot of criticism from all different directions about the decisions to go back out there, stay out there all night long, and recover the crew members that were clearly dead at those crash sites. But Rangers have sworn their life to one another. And the thing that a Ranger commits is that no matter what the circumstances, I will never let a fallen comrade fall into the hands of the enemy. So I had no choice but to drive back out there, to drive right back through what I just went through, and I was absolutely certain that I was going to die, and I was terrified at those moments before I got back on those Humvees and drove back out in the city streets.
You're the team leader, too, so I'm sure your other guys are feeling pretty much the same thing. How do you present calm, or at least try to lead them in this moment where you're all probably feeling that?
Yeah, two things really significant happened with me. One, I had a very strong Christian faith before joining the Army. And this very strong Christian faith stayed with me while I was in Panama, when I was in Kuwait, and definitely while I was in Somalia. And at the moments where I was convinced that I was going to die, those moments I started to pray, and I just asked God to be with me, and I can't really explain it, but at those moments, still absolutely certain that I was going to die, I found peace because of my Christian faith. But my men were looking to me, as you just said, and so there's a really good scene in the movie Blackhawk Down where really happened. One of my soldiers, after coming back with me to drop off Blackburn and getting ready to get dispatched to go out to find Mike Durant's crashed helicopter, he knew what I knew. We're going to die. He, like me, was married, and we're the only two guys in my squad that are married. I'm the old timer. He's a pretty new guy, but he's married. The rest of the guys in my squad are single, but they're all thinking the same thing. He walks up to me right before driving back out into the city and says, "Sergeant, I can't go back out there because I've got a wife at home, and I know I will die if I go back out there with you tonight." And at this moment, he was feeling, frankly, he had the courage to say what everybody around us was thinking, but just nobody wanted to say it to each other. He was basically saying, I know I'm going to die. And I pulled this guy off to the side, and instead of yelling at him or trying to, insult him, I just patiently, calmly said, "Look, man, I'm scared too. We all are." And then I said, "I don't want you to think about yourself as a coward just because you're afraid. In fact, in combat, if you don't have fear, there's probably something wrong with you. I told him the real difference between a hero and a coward in battle is not fear. It's what you do when you are afraid that makes the difference. This scene makes it in the movie Blackhawk Down. And I told him, look, I won't make you go back out there, but I need you on our vehicles. And the guys that are still out in those city streets, they need you. And almost exactly like you see in the movie Black Hawk Down, I was starting to drive away, and I looked in my rearview mirror, and I watched him reach down, picked up his squad automatic weapon, jumped in the back of the last Humvee, leaving those city streets or to go back out there with me, and spent the whole night, the rest of that night, on those vehicles with me. And he was absolutely convinced that he was going to die, but was prepared to give his life for the guys that are still in the city streets to have a chance at survival. And I've never been more proud of a soldier in all of my life.
It's hard to hear that and try to get back to the story when you hear that type of devotion. When you get back out there, what's the situation?
Yeah, we drive back through a couple of roadblocks. We're getting directions from a helicopter that I'm talking to on the radio, and he's telling me where to turn. There's a long column of vehicles behind us, and all of the guys that are infantry guys and door kickers are already in the city streets. We needed more guns, so we took the cooks and the supply clerks and everybody else, and we put them on 5-ton and deuce-and-a-half vehicles, 2.5-ton vehicles behind us, and rolled out into the city streets with just as many guns as we could. We drove down a little narrow road, getting close to the Durant crash site, and my vehicle came under an intense ambush. In the process, we were hit by rocket-propelled grenades and gunfire, and I backed out of the ambush. And we started to drive our way around the city, and as we were driving around the city to come into the crash site from the backside of the city, we linked up with a bunch of other Rangers from the Humvees that were trying to make their way back to the base. But quite frankly, the vehicles were so shot up that they couldn't even move anymore. They were being pushed by some of the large trucks. So we stopped what we were doing, grabbed all of the dead and the wounded off of those vehicles, put them on our Humvees, drove them back to the base, got more fuel, got more ammunition, got ready to go back out to get to the Durant crash site. But at this point, our commander, the task force commander, Major General William Garrison, realized we can't keep putting these Humvees in the city streets. They're getting shot to pieces. And these are the light-skinned Humvees. They didn't have armor back in those days. So we asked the United Nations if they would help us. And the United Nations, a couple of countries from the United Nations showed up with armor and tanks. The Malaysians came with their armored personnel carriers, and the Pakistanis came with a couple of tanks, and they met us all at our base. And at about 11 o'clock that night, we all drove back out there together. Me and my men stayed on the same Humvees. 3 of the 4 tires shot flat underneath us and stayed there until 9 o'clock the next morning, fighting back and forth and losing men all night long until the rest of the guys that were out there in the city streets could get on those vehicles and we can drive them back out of the city streets.
You're trapped in your Humvee, essentially. You can't go anywhere because 3 tires are shot out. How do you protect yourself? What tactics, logistics are you ordering and employing here?
Yeah, this is one of the challenges that kind of made Task Force Ranger look like we didn't know what we were doing. In fact, people criticize this, but we're on these light-skinned Humvees in narrow city streets, and most of the guys who flew in by helicopter are now fighting on foot from roof to, or from building to building, and they can move from spot to spot behind cover. These Humvees are just sitting ducks. I really call it, this is like shooting fish in a barrel. It's hard to miss those Humvees, and we became the bullet magnets. If you wanted to kill Americans, come to the streets where all of the Humvees are and shoot at the Humvees, which is basically what happened all night long. The Malaysian armor personnel carriers, I can't compliment these guys enough for their courage. They basically kept a driver and a gunner in those vehicles and then handed the rest of it over to us and said, we'll go wherever you ask us to go. We'll do whatever you ask us to do tonight. We're here to help out. The Pakistanis in their tanks, not so much. They rolled in there, got shot at a time or two, and rolled right back out of there and left the Humvees and these Malaysian APCs in the city streets. So we had so many dead and wounded from our task force that we couldn't put them inside these armored personnel carriers. Big white vehicles with giant UN letters painted on them because they were doing a UN mission. And what we ended up doing is putting the guys that were wounded inside the armored personnel carriers, putting the dead bodies on top, and just letting them hang off of the top of the Humvee, or those APCs, armored personnel carriers, which means the blood is just running down the sides of these white armored personnel carriers. And we really stayed there basically until everybody that was killed at the crash site, all of the bodies of the pilots and the crew from those helicopters could be recovered. Anybody who watched the news the next day will remember that one of those crash sites, Mike Durant's crash site, was ultimately overrun. I never made it there before that crash site was overrun. The 6 people that were on board were basically dragged through the city streets. Mike Durant is still alive. Everybody else was killed when they were overrun. Mike Durant was taken captive, and the rest of those bodies were being pulled through the city streets on the BBC and CNN for the whole world to watch the next morning. And this is what we drove back to when we finally made it back to the base. Like, there's still guys missing, and we don't know who's dead, we don't know who's alive, but we're watching it on CNN and BBC like everybody else in the world is watching it.
Jeff, we're going to take a quick break. We're going to have much more of your story here on Veterans Chronicles. Our guest this week on Veterans Chronicles is Jeff Struecker, a former U.S. Army Ranger, eventually retired as a U.S. Army chaplain, now a pastor in Georgia, and he's been narrating this incredible account of his task force in Somalia in connection with Blackhawk Down and how the U.S. Rangers came under extensive fire in October of 1993. Before we pivot to a later point in your military career, I think our listeners will be interested to know, how did you get out of being pinned down by all these people shooting at you and ultimately get back to the base?
Yeah, one of the things that was really a challenge for us is Task Force Ranger. Now, it wasn't just Rangers. It was other special operators from the Air Force and from the Navy and other special operators from the U.S. Army over there in the city streets together. And we didn't have the full array of the military capability with us. So we didn't have close air support, and we didn't have naval gunfire, and we didn't have jets and artillery to bail us out. We didn't even have American tanks, though we repeatedly asked for them. When we got in trouble that night, we had to ask the United Nations to come help out, which they did. And again, I can't thank enough the Malaysians for what they did that night. And other forces from the U.S. Army's 10th Mountain Division fighting their way to get to us and fighting by our side that night. What really happened is the next morning, when we got most of the dead and wounded out of the target building, they were basically assembled in 2 large casualty collection points. So we got the vehicles to those 2 large casualty collection points, pulled all of the wounded on the inside of the vehicles, put all of the dead bodies on top of the vehicles, drove them out. And I thought we had everybody that flew in by helicopters. I thought all of those guys were already on vehicles. So that the way that we left the next morning, this is about 9 o'clock in the morning, the tanks are gone. The Malaysian armor personnel carriers leave. The rest of the Humvees leave. And my platoon leader tells me that he and I will be the last 2 vehicles out of the target building. We're making sure that everybody that was in the target building is already on vehicles and out. So I'm the last Humvee, the last vehicle out of the target that day. And as we start to drive away, I guess I should say this, the road in front of us is glittering with bullet casings. And I mean, like the entire road is made out of brass. It's nothing but the morning sunlight is shining off of it, and it is bullet casings everywhere that I look. And I thought to myself, how could anybody survive that much gunfire? We're driving out of there. Got a guy on a Humvee, or I'm on my Humvee, and I've got a guy on a 50 caliber machine gun. So I told him, take his machine gun, face it to the rear. We're the last vehicle out. You take care of anybody who's coming after us, who is trying to still fight, this task force as we leave. And as we drive down the road, the guy on the 50 caliber calls down to me and says, "Sergeant, there's some men running down the road chasing after us." And I said, "Well, they must be bad guys, because apparently everybody's on the Humvees or the armored personnel carriers. Go ahead and light these guys up." And he says, "No, these look like they're our guys." So I lean over and look out the window, and sure enough, there's about 20 or 30 guys running down the road chasing us. I can see the terror in their eyes as the vehicles drive away, because they thought we were waiting for them to get to the vehicles. We thought everybody was already on the vehicles. We start driving away. To make a long story short, I pull up next to my boss, my platoon leader, and Larry Moores and I let the rest of the convoy go. We back up into the target building, and guys jump into the vehicles. And by this, I mean dive in head first, just hanging on with one arm as their feet are dragging on the ground. And the vehicles are so heavy laden with bodies that we can't keep loading people up. So the two of us, those two Humvees, take back as many guys as we can, and still about 10 or 15 of them have to run out of the city streets on foot. And eventually they make it back to this the closest United Nations spot was the stadium, the soccer stadium that was controlled by the Pakistanis. So we're all going to move to the Pakistani soccer stadium and then figure out who's dead, who's wounded, who's missing, who's still alive. That's basically what happens the next morning.
What's the mood like? What are you thinking once you get back to the base and ultimately have some time to think about this?
Yeah, I knew that this was bad all night long. It was going from bad to worse, but I didn't realize how many people were killed or wounded until we made it back to that soccer stadium. And then there's rows of stretchers. These guys over here are critically wounded, may not make it. These guys over here are in body bags, already killed. And these guys over here may be able to get some medical attention today, may not, because of how many people are wounded. And roughly half of the guys that were in the city streets that day from our task force are either killed or wounded. That's basically what the numbers look like the next morning. And somehow, and I can only give God credit for this, I walked away without a scratch.
Amazing. Well, that's a perfect transition to how a few years later you decided to end your active duty ranger career and pursue the military chaplain's path. Why'd you do that?
Well, it was basically Somalia that prompted me to leave the Ranger Regiment as a shooter and go become an Army chaplain. And it was because my faith made such a difference. Like, for me, it influenced everything that I did during that battle. And I really, at the moment where I was absolutely certain that I was going to die, I got this sense of peace that other guys around me didn't have. So I felt the Lord leading me to become an Army chaplain. I left the Army, as you mentioned. I had to go to school, get the education, go get some experience. And then I came back on active duty in January of 2001 as a chaplain and was stationed in the Army at the 82nd Airborne Division in Fort Bragg, North Carolina. And this is before the attack on September 11th, of course. And from there, went to the Rangers and went many, many times to Afghanistan and Iraq as an Army chaplain.
Well, let's talk about that. 9/11 happens, of course, and if you're at Fort Bragg, I'm sure just about everybody there knows they're going to be seeing some action pretty soon. So talk about your first deployment as a chaplain. Where'd you go, and how did you minister to the men?
Yeah. I should say that at this point, very, very few people, if you weren't in Desert Storm, you probably didn't have combat experience at all. By the time September 11th happens, I've already been to 3 different combat operations, and I kind of know what to expect. I'm in the 82nd Airborne Division. My unit, 3rd Battalion, the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment, gets sent to Afghanistan in January of 2003. So this is still very early on in the global war on terrorism. And at this point, the Iraq war hasn't started. We were supposed to be over there for a few months and then be replaced by another unit. But Iraq starts while we're over there, and what was supposed to be a few months eventually becomes almost a year, just a little bit short of a year. And we come back after 9 or 10 months in Afghanistan, basically holding down the war in Afghanistan, while almost everything else gets diverted to Iraq. Our battalion is located along the border of Pakistan and Afghanistan in numerous different little spots along that border, and comes regularly under attack. And my job as a chaplain is to go to each one of those spots. So I really spent almost that entire year with a rucksack on my back and flying from with a helicopter from site to site, spend a day or two, visit soldiers, go to the next site, spend a day or two, visit those soldiers, and do it again and again in kind of a giant ring. I called myself a circuit riding preacher, like the guys on horseback 150 years earlier. But that's really what I did while I was over in Afghanistan on that first deployment. And I was so proud of those paratroopers for the way that they fought.
What did those guys ask you? What did they want to know? What kind of encouragement did they need?
Yeah, early on, before we deployed to Afghanistan, my unit realized I'm one of the only guys in the unit with any combat experience. So lots of guys were asking me, what's it going to be like, Chaplain? What can I expect? When we get over there, then they start asking different questions like, hey, what happens to me if I get in a firefight and I get killed? And I think they trusted me enough to ask hard questions, honest questions, because they knew my background. They knew that I was a infantryman just like them, doing the same thing in combat a few years earlier that they're doing now. And I could understand where they were coming from. So I had the privilege of really a lot of those paratroopers opened their hearts up and were willing to listen to me just because of my previous experience. And I had a bit of a reputation at this point. Blackhawk Down the movie hadn't come out, but the book did, and many people were familiar with the book, and so they were familiar with my story.
As a chaplain, are you armed? Are you expected, if a hostile fire breaks out, to help out, especially if you have combat experience, or are there specific rules that you don't do that?
No, the Army chaplains are not armed. This is part of the U.S.'s commitment to the Geneva Convention. They're considered non-combatants, but I had a chaplain assistant with me who was armed and trained, and he was kind of my support or my security detail when I went out on missions, and I went out on a lot of missions. I think it freaked a lot of guys out that I'm on the battlefield and I wasn't armed. And frankly, a couple of them asked me like, hey, Chaplain, are you crazy? Don't you think you should have a weapon with you? And my standard answer, I really wasn't trying to be funny with this, is, hey, if the point comes in a big battle that I have to use a weapon, I'll pick up a weapon and use it. There'll be plenty of weapons to pick up and use, which means there'll be enough dead paratroopers that there will be plenty of weapons to pick up. You should hope that point doesn't happen. In other words, I know how to handle myself in a gunfight, and if it gets to the point that I have to pick up a weapon, I would do it, but I told the men in my unit, you should really hope that it doesn't get to this point.
Jeff, we'll take another quick break. We'll be right back with more of your story here on Veterans Chronicles. This is Veterans Chronicles. I'm Greg Corumbus. Happy to be joined today by Jeff Struecker, U.S. Army Ranger veteran and ultimately retired as a U.S. Army chaplain, now a pastor in Georgia. And Jeff, you were talking about going into combat with the different units that you were ministering to. Explain what that's like as a chaplain. Where are you as these operations take place and that sort of thing?
Yeah, so I would like to, say I left the Army's 82nd Airborne Division after one deployment to Afghanistan and went back to the Rangers and really rounded out the rest of my career. Spent several more years with the Rangers. During that time, deployed many times more to Afghanistan and also to Iraq. And because of my extensive combat experience as an infantryman, because of my experience in the Ranger Regiment, I kind of knew how Rangers operate. So I could think about, if a big mission was about to happen, I could anticipate where I might need to position myself during that mission. And quite often, my goal was to be close to the action, not so close that I'm stuck in the middle of it, but close enough to it that if people needed to get to me, I was I was close enough that they could get to me without having to get on a helicopter or a Humvee. So I'll just say it this way. I did 8 more deployments to Afghanistan and 5 more deployments to Iraq with the Rangers. And on those deployments, my goal was to be with those guys, but not so far in front that I was decisively engaged by enemy gunfire with them, but close enough to them that I was on the target with them or on the battlefield with them. And this was a bit different than I think some Army chaplains. They didn't have that kind of combat experience, nor could they think through where was the best place to position yourself on the battlefield. So I had an advantage here. But I also had an advantage in that my men, the men from my unit, were getting ready to go out into a target, and they knew this one could get really bad tonight, Chaplain, and we would like for you to go along with us. Would you be willing to go? And I generally, if I was available, I would say, yeah, of course I'll go with you tonight. If you think it's going to be that bad, I probably should go there with you. Eventually, I went many times onto the target, onto battlefields with my men because they wanted me to be there. And they also knew, because of my previous combat experience, we don't have to worry about the chaplain doing something stupid and getting himself killed. So that combined with, knowing the unit and the unit's tactics that well, gave me the opportunity to really be in the position on the battlefields where I needed to be during those many other deployments. And frankly, I got the chance to do some ministry to soldiers, to those special operators, that I probably wouldn't have been able to do if it wasn't for the fact that they trusted me. They knew me so well and they trusted me.
So that previous combat experience really was a way to identify with them.
Yeah. I didn't realize it at the time, but they had a great deal of respect for me. And that respect enabled me to go do things that maybe other chaplains wouldn't have been able to do.
So you said 8 additional tours in Afghanistan as a chaplain and then 5 in Iraq. So were you kind of shuttling in between, or were you coming home and bouncing back?
Yes, it was a little bit of both. So the Ranger Regiment was part of this Joint Special Operations Task Force that did regular deployments. They would be gone for a period of time, come back, refit, do some more training, go back over there. This was how I spent maybe the last 6 or 7 years in the Army. However, they were also the force that the U.S. military was using to go hit specific targets. So more than once, we were sent over out of the scheduled, out of the normal schedule to go do a specific mission on a specific target. And once that mission's over with, then you'll come back. Doesn't matter how long this mission lasts, you stay over there until it's over with, and you're still in the rotation to go back over again. So my wife and our children more than once saw me come back from Afghanistan, was back for a few weeks, only to get notified while we're on leave that a problem just came up. We're going to have to cut the leave short, get right back on airplanes, fly right back over there. I don't know how long we're going to be gone, but I do know we're going back over there again soon. And so some of them was a target set in Iraq. Got to go over there, go do some things, kill some bad guys in Iraq. Sometimes it was a target set in Afghanistan. Sometimes it was a regular rotation where half of my unit was in Iraq and half of my unit was in Afghanistan. And I would store my equipment in one spot, go travel to both, and then, end up spending time in both countries, which was extremely unusual for the rest of the U.S. military. Typically, the U.S. military did either one or the other. In the case of a Ranger battalion, they were doing both and doing both at the same time.
Just about 30 seconds before our next break here, would you say it's vastly different? I know the terrain and the people are obviously quite a bit different, but in terms of the soldiers and how they're thinking about what's in front of them, was it vastly different?
I will tell you, I'm going to date myself with this. These wars are so different that in terms of cartoons, I used to say Afghanistan is like the Flintstones and Iraq is like the Jetsons. They are two very different wars, and we're fighting them both at the same time. And you have to use very different tactics and very different techniques in one than the other, which means you have to be pretty agile to go from one to the other at the same time.
Amazing. We'll talk more about that in just a moment. We're talking with Jeff Struecker, a retired U.S. Army Ranger and U.S. Army Chaplain, now a pastor. We'll get more into that as well when we come right back on Veterans Chronicles. This is Veterans Chronicles. I'm Greg Columbus. I'm honored to be joined in studio today by Jeff Struecker, retired U.S. Army Ranger and U.S. Army Chaplain, now a pastor in Georgia. And we've been talking about his combat experience in Panama and Kuwait and Somalia, and now in Iraq and Afghanistan as a chaplain. The old adage, of course, is there are no atheists in a foxhole. So I'm sure you dealt with all different types of personalities in Iraq and Afghanistan with your Ranger units. What did you see from folks who either came in with a deep faith or perhaps didn't have much of one at all, and how they came to you as a result of what was happening around them on the battlefield?
That adage, there is no atheist in foxholes, it's in one sense true, in another sense not true. Like if you showed up to combat as an atheist without much of a faith background, you would probably leave combat without much of a faith background. If you went there with some faith, you would probably leave there your faith having been strengthened. The guys or gals in the military that are in the middle, not really sure what they believe, I found that those people got pulled to the extremes, like thought that you had faith, but really you were just borrowing your parents' faith and it wasn't your own. Those folks, they tended to get so disillusioned by what they saw of humanity in combat that they kind of lost whatever faith that they may have had. But again, in my opinion, not sure how strong that faith really was. For some that had, the genesis of faith, it really got strengthened while they were in combat. And I watched men and women become really rock solid in their faith from combat. I watched men and women who were so distraught by what they saw or what they were asked to do that it shook them to their core. And for me, one of my jobs was to try to help people process spiritually as well as emotionally and psychologically what they experienced in combat. And I considered it a great honor to be able to walk with warriors who had just seen some pretty crazy stuff.
Did the people more on the atheistic end still come to you, even though they didn't necessarily share your faith?
Yeah, I had this privilege of people knew my background. They knew who I was. I was really open about what I believed, but I didn't shove it down anybody's throat. I treated a grown man or a grown woman like an adult and said, if you want to talk, I'm here to talk. And many of them respected that, but they also knew my background, and so they knew that guy knows what he's talking about because he's been there. And so even atheists would come up to me and say, I got to talk to you about what just happened last night. Like, here's what I'm experiencing today. Is this normal? How do I deal with this? And so I was able to work with people from all different walks of life, all different kinds of faith backgrounds.
How much have you heard from these guys and gals after your military service ended?
Yeah, I retired from the Army in 2011. I retired in Columbus, Georgia, which is the adjacent city to Fort Benning and the home of the Ranger Regiment, Ranger School, Airborne School. So I had the privilege of staying in touch with a lot of guys that I served with in combat for a long, long time. And quite honestly, one of the reasons why my family and I retired in Columbus is so that we could stay around warriors for the rest of our life, because I am so proud of those guys and gals. Our country doesn't know what this generation has done for their freedom, and I'm proud of a project like this that's preserving.
I'm guessing you were also in Iraq during the most difficult times there, the insurgency and the sectarian fighting, urban combat. That's what you experienced in Somalia, but not necessarily what everyone's used to. So when things aren't going well, how do you help folks deal with that?
Yeah, one of the things, I'll just give you a quick example of this. I felt the responsibility to do is to make leaders aware of what they're about to experience, or sometimes to give leaders perspective on what they're going through. Like, I had some battalion commanders who were getting ready to go to combat, and in their mind they thought, we're good enough, we've trained hard enough, we can go there, fight, and come back and not lose anybody. And then when the first soldiers from that unit were killed in action, those commanders were really distraught by it. And because I was a chaplain and they knew about my combat experience, I could pull those commanders off to the side and say, look, this is war. and people are going to die. And you created an unrealistic expectation if you thought you could bring all of your men home. I wish you could. I wish we could. I wish that those guys didn't get killed, but they have. And you have to come to grips with the fact that you're going to lose warriors in this battle. But you also have to balance, am I willing to go do this next battle knowing that I may lose a whole lot of guys? Meaning, as a commander, part of your job is to weigh the risk versus the rewards for this battle and decide, is this thing worth losing men and women for? And if not, then don't do it. Some of those commanders, they just didn't process things that way. They should have, but they didn't. Because again, they didn't have the military experience that I had. By the time that I left the Army, this was something that I like to point out. When I first joined the Army, guys were retiring with more than 20 years who had never seen combat. And the saying when I joined the Army was, if you ever go to combat in your entire military career, this is what it's going to be like. A few years into Afghanistan and Iraq, nobody in the Army was saying that. The statement was, when you go to combat, this is what it's going to be like. And the next time that you go, it's going to be different. Meaning the Army itself had this amazing amount of combat experience that really hasn't happened, if you were to go back, since World War II, or probably since the colonial army and the Revolutionary War. You haven't had that kind of military experience this broad with this many people like you do with this generation of warriors serving in the U.S. military.
You've explained it well, Jeff, but you mentioned a moment ago that you think our nation needs to have a much better understanding of the warriors of this generation and what they've done for our freedom. I don't know if there's a specific event or a specific soldier or two that kind of crystallizes that for you, or maybe just more in general, what do you want folks to know about them?
I get the privilege, because of Blackhawk Down, to talk to audiences all over America, and many of them, nobody has any military experience in the room. They just want to hear, they want a guy to tell them what it was really like, and they know that I was one of those guys there, so I can tell them what it was really like. And a thing that has started to concern me for years now is that there is a massive part of the U.S. population that doesn't know anybody who served in the military and has no context for what it might be like for somebody who's over there. Then you have a very small portion, less than 1/2% of the U.S. population, that has served in combat, and those families associated with it. And now you're starting to have this haves and have-nots divide in America. Some people have some idea of what it's like. Even though they weren't there, they have a cousin or an uncle that was over there, or a mother-in-law that was over there. And then you have those that have no military experience. And that's the part that concerns me. So what I really want those that don't have anybody in their life that have any military experience to hear is that there are brave men and women in an all-volunteer force, there's never been a draft, who have gone now for 20 years again and again and again to combat so that you don't have to. You'll never know what it was like for them, but you do need to at least go to bed at night thanking God that those men and women exist. Because if they weren't willing to sign up and to keep going, you and I would be serving in combat, or your sons and daughters would be drafted to serve in combat. So America needs to lay their head on their pillow at night thanking God for the warriors that are doing this again and again and again for almost 20 years now.
Just a few minutes left in our conversation with Jeff Struecker. And Jeff, I've talked to various chaplains or folks who know chaplains in recent years, and there's been some debate about how much religious freedom you have, what you can and you can't say to the soldiers. Did you have restraints on what you could do?
When I served as an Army chaplain, I had great relationships with my commanders. My commanders trusted me, and I didn't violate their trust. So they basically said, Chaplain, you do what you do, and you do it well, and I'm going to give you whatever resources that you need to do what you do well. I want you to take care of my unit, and I want you to take care of them well. And when there were some sticky situations where, okay, my faith in the public arena may get a little bit difficult, those commanders basically said, I know you. chaplain, and I know your heart, so do your thing and do it right, and don't, take advantage of the situation. And that's the way I try to conduct myself. But it basically boiled down to the relationships that I had. In fact, I've said this for years. Wars are fought and won by relationships. The greatest units on the battlefield are not the guys who have the best technology. They have the relationships with one another that would be willing to do what other units wouldn't be able to do. And my relationship with my commanders were, Chaplain, we trust you. Go do your thing. Just don't make us look stupid, but go do your thing.
And so, obviously, there was great value put on the chaplaincy in the military, and that has to make you...
That's what I experienced. Now, I will say that there were no question other chaplains that didn't have that experience. And for those folks, I don't know how I would have handled myself if I got placed in a situation they got placed in. Well, I do know this. I would never compromise my faith. Even an Army career is not worth compromising my faith.
So you retired as a chaplain in 2011, and what did you do then?
Became a pastor of a church in Columbus, Georgia, and I am still trying to reach warriors and their families living in Columbus, Georgia now. Still trying to reach out to the military community from Fort Benning, Georgia.
And I'm guessing a lot of those folks are going to your church?
Yeah, I love being around warriors.
And just a couple of minutes left. I know you're also a speaker, and you go around quite a bit, talking, I'm sure, about your experience as well as your faith, and talk about why you're so energized by those opportunities.
Yeah, one of the things I get the privilege of doing, as I said just a second ago, is talking to audiences that don't have any context about what it's like to be in the military. I don't try to recruit for the military. That's not my thing. I just want audiences to respect the guys and the gals that are serving. But I also, as much as I have the opportunity, try to point the attention to military families. So I'll take a second to do that here.
Sure.
I don't think most people understand the stress and the sacrifice that a military family makes. When a son sends his mama off to go to combat, or when a wife puts her husband on a plane and goes to combat, they don't know if they're coming back alive. And this happens over and over and over again. So what these military families have done for the freedom of our country is very, very few people understand what they've done. There's no monuments here in Washington, D.C. to the military family, and there really should be. In fact, in my opinion, there should be a monument on the National Mall to the military family and the sacrifices that they've made. Not just those that have lost somebody, but those that have sacrificed birthdays and special events to let warriors go overseas and defend our freedoms. And those military families really deserve our thanks as well.
There's still deployments going out of Fort Benning, I'm sure. So how do you minister to those families while their loved ones are gone?
One of the things that I feel like I can do now for the sake of the fight for our freedom is to look at a warrior in the eyes and say, while you're overseas, we're going to take care of your family. And we're going to take care of your family like they're our own. So if they need anything, you don't have to stress out about it from 13,000 miles away. We will be there for them. And that's the thing that I think I owe the military families, because people did that for my wife and children while I was gone.
With such a varied and full military career, when you look back, what are you most proud of, and what do you think of most?
The thing that I'm most proud of is the men that I served with. Like, there were many days that I got up in the morning, went to work, and thought, these guys are all better warriors than I am. And I am working as hard as I can just to be able to keep up. And I don't mean keep up with them. I didn't want to let them down. I am convinced, by God's mercy, I had the privilege of serving with the greatest Americans, the greatest warriors America has ever put on the battlefield. And I will go to my grave thanking God for the privilege of being with those guys on the battlefield. The guys who were willing to shoot bad guys that needed to be shot, but also guys that had the restraint to not shoot somebody who didn't need to be shot. And I watched it with my own eyes in total awe of America's military. And I'll just go away proud to be able to stand in the same ranks with those guys and gals.
Jeff, it's an amazing story. Stories, really. All these different facets of your career, and you're still serving military active duty personnel and military families today, so we thank you for that. as well. And thank you very much for your time with us today. We greatly appreciate it.
It's been great to be with you.
Thank you. Jeff Struecker, retired U.S. Army Ranger, also now retired U.S. Army Chaplain and a pastor in Columbus, Georgia. I'm Greg Corombos. This is Veterans Chronicles. Hi, this is Greg Corombos, and thanks for listening to Veterans Chronicles, a presentation of the American Veterans Center. For more information, please visit AmericanVeteransCenter.org. You can also follow the American Veterans Center on Facebook, and on Twitter, we're at AVC Update. Subscribe to the American Veterans Center YouTube channel for full oral histories and special features, and of course, please subscribe to the Veterans Chronicles podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks again for listening, and please join us next time for Veterans Chronicles.